So good afternoon, and thank you for coming today to the South Big Data Hub's Roundtable. I'm Dr. Leah Shanley. I'm co-executive director of the South Big Data Innovation Hub. We are based at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and we are co-lead the hub with Georgia Tech. For those of you who may not be familiar, the South Big Data Hub works to catalyze and strengthen partnerships between academia, industry, and government to apply data science and analytics to real-world challenges. Before we get started, we ask that those in the room silence your phones, please. And those that are watching online, we ask that you mute your mics, and we will be monitoring the chat box in WebEx. So if you have a question, you can type in your question there, and Sienna, who's in the back of the room here monitoring, will raise her hand and ask a question on your behalf. For those of you who tweet, do we have the tweet slide up? Yes, well, right before that. Hashtag SBDH for South Big Data Hub, so hashtag SBDH17. We also will be trying to monitor Twitter as well for that hashtag, so if you have a question for the panelists or a comment you'd like to make, please also use that. And you can follow the Hub on Twitter at South Big Data Hub. So welcome to the Roundtable. This is a monthly series we host on data science topics, exploring the emerging research challenges and potential solutions. Today's Roundtable is also being co-hosted by Meredith Lee, who's the co-executive or the executive director of the West Hub. As Juan, thank you. Juan is in Arizona, and Rand is in California, so we've got the West Hub represented. And we also have the Northeast Hub, which is here in Pittsburgh. So Renee Beston is the co-executive director based at Columbia University. So our discussion today will focus on anti-social computing and the new information environment. Our panelists will discuss the changing norms and social interaction, conversation, public discourse, and news reporting around that. We have 4 distinguished panelists with us today, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Nitin Argawal. He is the Jerry Malden Entergy Endowed Chair and Distinguished Professor of Information Science at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Nitin is the Director of Collaboratorium of Social Media and Online Behavioral Studies. His research interests include social computing, deviant behavioral modeling, group dynamics, influence, trust, collective action, social cyber forensics, which we're going to ask you about later, health informatics, data mining, and privacy. Dr. Kathleen Carley, whom many of you here in the room know, is Professor of Computation, Organizations, and Society and the Center Director for Computational Analysis of Social and Organizational Systems in the Institute for Software Research, School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research combines cognitive science, network science, agent-based modeling, social media analytics, and language technology to address complex social and organizational problems. We have Dr. Huan Liu, who's a professor of computing science and engineering at Arizona State University. His research interests are in data mining, machine learning, social computing, artificial intelligence, investigating interdisciplinary problems that arise in many real-world data-intensive applications with high-dimensional data of disparate forms such as social media. Well, that to me sounds like big data. And Dr. Rand Waltzman, who is currently Senior Information Scientist at the Rand Corporation of Santa Monica, so Rand at Rand. Prior to joining Rand, he was Acting Chief Technology Officer of Software Engineering Institute in Washington, D.C. of Carnegie Mellon University. And before that, he did a 5-year tour of duty as Program Manager of Information Innovation Officer at DARPA, where he created and managed the Social Media and Strategic Communications Program and the Anomaly Detection at Multiple Scales Insider Threat Detection Program. And so I met this cast of characters, this merry band, several years ago through a mutual colleague, Dr. Rebecca Goolsby, who's at Office of Naval Research. And we put on a workshop at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I was at the time, on human computation, and had a group discussion on what is the role of anti-social computing. And so this roundtable kind of, the idea for that sprung from that meeting. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Kathleen.
So good day. So I'm going to describe to you some of the findings on bots and fake news that from our group and that's been done by the students and myself here. So today, the war of big ideas is being waged in a cyber-mediated environment that's like the Wild West. We found that the vigilantes like Anonymous are actually changing and self-policing the environment. Data providers like Twitter and YouTube are creating, policing, and evolving an environment that is changing on a daily basis, that is ripe for abuse, and that consensus is often treated with greater consequence than the truth. We find viral marketing strategies being used to actually shape the conversation and to build communities. Consider the following 3 facts. First, news agencies no longer have the financial resources to do deep investigative reporting, so they rely on citizen reporters, media releases, and press events to spread the news. Social media has changed the way news is being consumed and the way it is being delivered, so that now short sound bites, 140-character tweets, and scroll-through technology are directing the traffic to the news and providing only high-level information, making it difficult to get more deep information. Trolls and bots are being used to create groups and spread information, and they actually are shaping the conversation through dense community creation techniques. Using a combination of social network analytics and machine learning, our group has done a number of studies to look at these kind of issues. For example, we did a Twitter study where we actually collected information on Syrian extremists. We began with a set of known members of ISIS and used those to scroll out and find a set of other individuals who are engaged in the same conversation. Many of those individuals became known as members of ISIS, and others were thought to be members of ISIS by companies like Anonymous. Hidden within this dense community, which was driven by new events that were going on at the time, there's this bot called the Farabi Gnome bot. The Farabi Gnome bot is actually a collection of bots that work together to keep mentioning and retweeting each other and to keep mentioning people like Hanan al-Sabai, who was touted by Al-Qaeda as one of the crucial motivators for foreign fighters, tricking the members, followers of al-Sabai to following the core Farabi bot. Those supporters were then led into another site, which was a benefactor for the Farabi bot. This particular benefactor, it was actually an app that let you sign up for and provide donations to a charity for the children of Syria. This particular charity was a well-known money laundering site for ISIS. So this particular bot and bots like this, these social bots or collection of bots, are actually often part of these dense communities, and they're actually so involved in it that they actually will affect how those groups operate, what they think about, and what they're saying, as they did in this particular case. This particular study, however, cannot be replicated. Many of the members of this community were actually suspended by ISIS, and the data is no longer available. The next study I want to describe briefly involves 2 different studies, and this showing more about what these social bots can do. On your left, you actually see a number of dense communities. These are communities who are engaged in political conversations. They have lots of different political agendas and do various kinds of things. For example, one of them is involved in pornography, one of them is following various other kinds of things, and so on. But social bots lurk within these and on the fringes of these and do a number of things. One, they take 2 different communities with 2 different agendas, and they pull them together. They act as a bridge that links the communities together so they all get the same kind of information. Once they've built the bridge, it's hard for the individuals who are members of those communities to tell what is coming from one community and what's coming from another. An example of this was a bot that worked to actually combine the alt-right with an evangelical group, creating a common linkage between them, and then tricking Twitter effectively into rank ordering certain tweets from certain individuals so that it appeared that all of the middle-aged women who were part of the evangelical group were completely in favor of the alt-right behavior. Dense communities, of course, are used, once they're formed, often use things like, often link beyond Twitter. It's not just a Twitter story. These, both the bots and the members of these communities will actually send out the messages to and get messages from a variety of other sites. YouTube, Just Paste It, Facebook are examples. And many times what they're referencing in their URLs are what appear to be news sites, many of which are actually fake news sites. What this does is it creates a groundswelling of what appears to be strong support for common ideas, even though it's not, it's, again, just fiction. So you get a resulting mixture of truth and fiction being spread to people so fast through a series of sound bites that there's not an ability for them to check it, and causing emotions then to skyrocket out of control in these groups. So these kind of echo chambers that are formed with the false news propagating around them get this increase in emotions. There can be consequences far beyond, of course, just opinion formation. One of our other studies found that as you got these groups echoing out of control and leading to high negative sentiment on Twitter, that you would get follow-ups and actual cyber attacks on the country. So if you have these echo chambers basically forming, they start saying, oh, Russia is bad, then you will see an upsurge of cyber attacks on Russia. So that's an example of some of the kinds of behaviors that we're seeing, the ways they go beyond it. All in all, what we're saying is that these social bots, these collection of bots that act as a group, will come in, they will build communities and direct them toward particular accounts, causing those accounts to get more followers, and also often getting you to apply to be part of it. They may get you to come onto their site to allow them to tweet from your site, and so you become part of the supposed groundswelling of support, and you may not even know that that's coming from your account because of the frequency with which the tweets are coming out. They build bridges between separate communities, making them appear like a common community. They develop echo chambers in which emotions run rampant and so on. Standard approaches for finding bots cannot find these, and many of the ways in which data by Twitter is normally collected prevent people from seeing that these exist. New data collection and new techniques are needed to find them.
Excellent. Wonderful. So with that, we will hand it over to Nitin.
Thank you. Thank you. Next slide, Chris. Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen, for putting the nice segue between what you have been doing and what I'm going to talk about. And as you can see here, the cover is basically from the Wired magazine. This was a few weeks ago, and they had actually interviewed a Macedonian teenager where the average monthly salary is $371, but this guy, just by running 2 fake news blog sites, earned $16,000 within 4 months, and which is the main motivation for him and some of his peers who are doing the same work. What they're doing is they're not even creating the content, they're just lifting the content from some alt-right or some extremely conservative fake news sources, and they take those content and put it on their blog sites. The impact that this has been felt by the survey that was done by Pew Research Center, which mentioned 34% Americans trust the information they get from social media, and 14% Americans consider that information as very trustworthy, very important, right? Which is a huge percentage when you think in terms of the electorates. 1% could make a huge difference there. So our work is basically looking at how blogs are used in framing a narrative and shaping the political discourse. There are millions of bloggers, however, only very few of them become very, very successful or very, very popular, very, very influential. They certainly do not represent the entire electorate. They are highly underrepresented population, yet they are able to drive the discourse through various ways that we are going to discuss next, and make sure that they can dominate the voices of many. Internet is the first medium in history that has native support for group communication and conversation at the same time, which means that if you look at television space, radio space, it's one to many. If you talk about telephones, it is one to one. When you talk about social media, it is many to many, right? Which brings all these conversations together, helps in developing this discourse, the political communication. Further, internet has become the mode of carriage for all the other media, meaning everything comes to internet, everything digital migrates to the internet space. All the videos, all the memes, images, they are documented, they are curated on the internet, they are further distributed which is the third point here, consumers, the previous consumers, have now become the producers, but more importantly, distributors. So I see something, I can easily and very conveniently distribute to all my friends, right, which can be further propagated or shared and can be seen by many others. Right. So here the need is not just for the financial incentive, it is also to feed the hunger that we have for the political or the online political hyper-partisanship that we see in internet spaces. Some of the findings I've shown here, we have done some studies with Kathleen, Rebecca, Huan, and many other researchers on studying the blogosphere space in Ukraine and Russia conflict. And what we have observed is some of these images that are on your left that were propagated on some of the very high influential bloggers and their blogging spaces. So these are the memes that travel on blogs and further shared through sources or through platforms like Gab. How many of you have heard of something called Gab.ai? Okay, it is an invitation-only social network, but they are very liberal in giving these invitations or in handing out these invitations. But they themselves proudly say that we are the ones who are rejected by Twitter, so we own this free speech space. So if you have time, please feel free and check out the Gab.ai platform. The others are Reddit, Discord. Discord is like a social media channel for gamers, Slack for gamers, if you will. If you have heard of what Slack is, it's Slack for serious gamers. So we have developed these tools called blog trackers and focal structures analysis, which track these blogs and identify who are the influential bloggers, what are the leading narratives in these spaces, how fringe narratives become mainstream and so on, what are the blogs that subscribe to those ideologies, and how these are further shared in spaces like Twitter, Facebook, vContacte, and so many other platforms. Focal structure analysis is another tool that tries to identify the coordination of this information campaign. So I'll give you a very glimpse of these campaign coordination networks. This is one of the networks that we have. We developed from the Saudi Arabian Women's Right to Drive campaign, and this is a 3D visualization which can help us understand the roles and the various structures of the network. And I would encourage you guys, if you have time, to just click on this link and visit this 3D visualization space, which can tell you how you can identify these. And we have applied this also on many other campaign networks in Ukraine-Russia conflicts, even ISIS coordination and recruitment, radicalization campaigns and such. With that, I'll stop and leave all those thoughts for later questions. Okay. Thank you.
Great. All right. Next up, I think we had Juan.
Yes. All right, with Kathleen and Nitin's talk, and I think the audience should be able to know about the bots and blogs and all of these. I would like to discuss something about social media intelligence and AI. I wonder if the audience can see the slides?
Yes.
No? Yes? Okay. All right. So it's obviously social media data is big. And it's so big and also everywhere. But we know big data is not just simply big, right? So usually we talk about like 4 V's, and social media has all the 4 V's. Okay. Then a lot of researchers would like to use social media intelligence to study human behavior and to understand what's going on in the world. So it provides a new lens. I have been doing big data for maybe 20-some years. So my original research is about feature selection, to how to reduce the big data to manageable size. But conventional methods really find that they are the bottleneck, and big data challenges traditional thinking. So now, for example, I'm even at CMU still it's not everything is equipped by big data, but very soon, okay? Even in the room, if people ask, the smartest person in the room is? So anybody has the answer in the room? No? Okay. The smartest person in the room is the room. Okay, this is the part, the scary part. And so there's you have heard about this computational thinking, but now we also have seen the big data. Big data has produced so much influence and impact. And it seems like when we have big data, we can solve all the problems. You have heard about the deep learning, right? And of course, everybody is now doing machine learning, but you have also heard about a lot of scary news about AI, like artificial intelligence. It beats like human champions in chess, in Go, poker, Jeopardy. It seems like AI is going to overtaking everything, but that's not true, actually. Okay, I will discuss more later. But in this context, anti-social computing context, AI can make bots more intelligent, and social media intelligence less intelligent. So now, next slide. Bots and in different forms and varied roles, they are everywhere. There is a blog talking about like 30% of users can be deceived by chatbots, and 51% online are not humans, and 7% of tweets are spam bots. So it's everywhere. The misinformation facilitated by bots, actually, it's really it has a lot of negative impact. If you heard about the Cambridge Analytica, recently they boasted like they helped Trump to win presidential election, but if you really read about this, you will see big data alone actually couldn't win everything. If you read about the blog about a news report about the rise of the weaponized AI propaganda machine, and it really painted a picture that big data can solve everything. But now, I would like to move on to the last slide. When AI meets social media intelligence, AI is a double-edged sword. So it can help us too, okay? And because humans are easy to fool, I already mentioned, but we can try to build AI system to battle them. And nowadays, we also heard about that bots are fighting bots. The fighting can last for years, okay? But obviously, if bots are fighting bots, that means they're not intelligent enough, right? So we have a way to do some research and use AI to help improve social intelligence. So the last point I would like to make is we need to enable user-controlled information, filters, and checkers. The way to counter anti-social computing is really to promote and build diverse collective intelligence. I would like to emphasize diverse and diversity. Diversity is so important for us to detect, verify, and exposing misinformation, and with very, very important. Okay, we cannot blindly count on big data. And at the end, I would like to mention 2 tutorials we give last year, or in the last year framework. we presented a bot detection tutorial with Kathleen and Carley, and we also presented a misinformation detection tutorial last year. So I will end here and wait for questions and answering
So
later.
we'll do
Thank you.
questions at the end. Thank you. Rand, have you next?
Yes. Okay. So there's just a second. I'm trying to. Oh yeah. So there's certainly been a lot of discussion in the news lately about fake news. Well, and when you listen to all these discussions, you might have the feeling that fake news is something new. Well, fake news is actually really, really old, and the whole idea of doing this is really, really old, and it affects the entire information environment. And what the technology today allows all sorts of people to do is to get in and modify the environment, and screw around with the environment in people's heads and so on. And fake news is an example of what used to be termed, and what still is termed, a KGB term called active measures. And you might have heard the term active measures thrown around, and I just thought I would, somebody asked me the other day, well, can you tell us in 60 seconds, what active measures, what does that really mean? So here's a little statement I wrote up, and I just thought I would throw that out to you. It says, active measures are techniques used to manipulate groups of people, anywhere from 10 to a billion, using information as a weapon into doing whatever the perpetrator wishes while making those people think it was their idea. It does not matter whether the information is true, half true, or false, as long as it gets the job done. Active measures include use of forgeries, false front organizations, targeted messaging campaigns, using whatever combination of types of media that will be most effective on the targeted audiences. Active measures are extremely effective for everything from large-scale criminal activity to mass marketing campaigns to massive-scale political and social influence operations. There are active measures mercenaries who have no allegiance and no moral scruples. At some point, and I think we're pretty much almost there, active measures completely dominate the information environment, and objective truth and reality become almost meaningless or irrelevant concepts. At that point, Jack London's famous quote, "Only the strongest wins," gives way to the new statement, "Only the best bullshitter wins."
Yeah.
And I would refer you to a spectacular little book written by Professor Harry Frankfurt at Princeton called On Bullshit. And in this book, he makes a very important distinction, and the distinction between a liar and a bullshitter or a con man. So a liar is somebody who will try to convince you of something. They'll try to convince you something is true that they themselves believe to be false. It doesn't matter whether it really is, but they believe it's false, and they're going to try to convince you it's true. A con man or a bullshitter, on the other hand, has no regard for the truth or falsity of what they're saying. It's irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is it going to get you to do what I want you to do? That's the only real question. And we have come to a situation where our entire information environment is basically dominated by this kind of conversation. So what you do about that, that remains to be seen. But that is the state we have achieved and where we are. So I think I'll just leave it at that, just a general observation, and let the question start.
Fantastic. That's a great way to rev us up. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the research you're doing and questions there, one of the things that came up in the discussion is with the prominence of this in the news lately, we're now seeing a rapid increase in the amount of research in this area, and it's not necessarily all good research because there may be a lack of understanding of the limitations of the tools that we're using and limitations of the social media platforms. So for the panel here, how does the social media platform affect the data that you're using, and how do you address that?
Go ahead.
So one of the things that you have to recognize in most of these social media is that the data providers themselves have put constraints on what information is provided and how it is provided and how much you can get access to. So a lot of this work that's out there on Twitter, for example, doesn't even recognize the fact that when you tweet and he retweets you and I retweet him, my retweet of you goes to him. So there's no way to trace the path of the real diffusion. Okay, That's one thing. Secondly, a lot of the data is not geotagged, so understanding where it is coming from is extremely difficult. Thirdly, the data sampling, which most people and most secondary data providers use, which is doing keyword search or using these bounding boxes like geographic things, they think they're getting random samples within those. In fact, they're not at all random because the data that's being collected is being vetted in a certain ways that actually gives you biased samples. So like the results we gave you, if we had used the standard way people collect data from Twitter, which is just using keywords, we would never have found those bots. We had to do a deep dive onto the conversation. So you really have to understand the technology and understand the way its APIs are shaping the data that you're getting, and then you have to use anti-biasing data techniques. Do you want to add?
I would like to add a few things there. Certainly what Kathleen has said is something that we should all be focusing on. And furthermore, when you do research on Twitter, especially through the APIs, we should be aware of the fact that Twitter APIs only give us 1% of the data that is a complete sample. So it's not representative sample that we get through APIs. There are other workarounds that if you have access to the fire hose, then you can get larger data sets, but those also have certain limitations, such as location information is not available, and if you want to do geo inferencing, so it may not be as accurate as possible. The other thing that I would like to highlight here is most of the research that I have come across looks at these platforms in isolation. So if you're doing research in Twitter, you're focusing only on Twitter. If you're doing research on blogs, you're focusing only on blogs or YouTube and such. However, there is a need for a more concerted effort where you can analyze the whole entire social media ecosystem as a whole organism and see how things evolve in social media space. Maybe just bring in a couple of social media channels such as blogs and Twitter, blogs and YouTube, and so on, where you can understand how a narrative is built, how it is shaped, and then further how it is disseminated or travels on the social media platforms. So looking at multiple channels is very, very critical, especially when you're talking about things like misinformation, fake news, propaganda, and so on.
One or
Yes.
Would you like to add?
Yes, I'm going to add. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes, good. All right. About the platform. Okay, I can start from the individuals first. So how many of you use the personalized information filters? Or probably like in the news, do you have automatic news feed for you? Okay, so with the big data, and we are inundated by so much information. So it's impossible for us to look at all of them. That's why we rely on this kind of a personalized information filter to feed us with the information we want. But there's a catch here. So that means the platform can feed you the information they want to feed you. That's number one. But if you look at it from the platform's point of view, it's even more scary because it's a machine operated, right? So they received also a lot of information. And how could they rank and recommend? That's why this is the danger imposed by the bots. And the bots, they can game the system and they can make the fake news, as Rand mentioned, on the top. Then if you use the filter, then you will only receive those, the platform site, they consider they are trendy, they are hot, and they feed to you. So this is also related to what I'm talking about, the diversity. So then the more you use the filter, the less diverse it is. And then you are tuned to the news and the information they feed you. So that's the problem. And now we need to figure out a way. I also mentioned that we need to enable user-controlled information filter. Not like blindly, they just feed us. After we present our profile, they just feed us information. Yeah, That's all from me.
Rand?
I'm sorry. What do you say? It was hard to hear.
Okay, the question was, what are the limitations of using the social media data? How does the platform you're using, like Twitter or Facebook, limit the kind of data you have that you can do research on?
How does the platform limit it? Well, I think that, so. Part of the thing with the data is that you need to, it's not only the contents themselves, but you need to be able to put the data in a context. So very few people actually talk about the larger context. Social media itself, all the platforms, in total don't exist in a vacuum. They're embedded in a larger reality. And so in order to actually use the platforms correctly or exploit them in a reasonable way, you have to be able to also exploit the content or, take into account the larger context in which they exist. And so far, people aren't really doing that. So that's one issue that you need to worry about. So that's a limitation. One limitation is people are not using the context in which the platforms are embedded in a larger sense. Another thing is most of the analytics to date have been sort of tech-centric. Okay, but that's not the future. The future of social media really is multimedia. So, if you look at Snap, for example, Snapchat. Snapchat is an example of the first step in the direction of multimedia-centric social media. And right now, there aren't really any really good analytic tools available to do social media analytics on multimedia data. You can't rely on the metadata. You can't rely on anything. You have to actually work with the media itself, with images, with video, with the speech. And you have to find a way to actually integrate those together because that's clearly the trend for the future. So that's another issue. So that's not a question of the platform, really. It's a question of, what the analytic technology behind it is. But still, I would say the biggest limitation of the platforms is not being able to take context into account. And, you want to also be able to, as has been pointed out, these things they're all biased in different ways. And you also have to have technology to sort of black box them and understand, to sort of reverse engineer, well, what bias are they using? And so you have to be able to do that in order to actually make real use out of these things. So.
Great.
May I add something?
Sure.
Okay, so, yeah, and at this year's Trip AI conference, that's one of the two prominent AI conferences in the world. And we presented a tutorial. We present a tutorial on social data bias in machine learning and impact evaluation and correction. And this is, if you visit my webpage and just search my name, either use Bing or Google, you will be able to find my homepage, the homepage, just scroll down. It's a AAA 2017 tutorial on social data bias. It discusses many biases due to, basically we talk about the platform. One is about the platform. The second one is about the manipulation. So actually people can attack the platforms to make their data more available than it's supposed to be. Yeah, that's all.
Great. So Kathleen, can you give me an example from your research about how bots and trolls and other actors have controlled the conversation over time?
So an additional
one, yeah.
Okay. So one of the additional examples that we saw was in looking at what we were at that point calling Ukrainian elves, as opposed to the Russian trolls. Got to have fun in science. We were actually able to find some of these bots that were actually actively engaged in discussions that were linking various groups from different communities in Russia and so on with various communities in the US. And we're actually directing them to think about and talk about various extremist ideas. That's one thing. As another example, in another case, again, back with the Ukrainian stuff, there is one group where they were actually using these bots to support their discussions, and that led the people to start communicating, and then they brought in fake images spread by bots and spread by people, and some of those images were, lots of pornography, trying to get young men to be recruited. In other cases, they were using things like images of soldiers that were supposedly U.S. soldiers who were raping someone else, and they were actually photoshopped images. And so they were transmitting these images and getting people riled up by them, even though the images were false. Those are two examples.
Mm-hmm. So Nitin, you had talked to me a little earlier before we got started about some of the complexity of how to track what's going on in blogs and how different blogs are influencing the conversation. Could you step me through just maybe an overview of the methodology you use and maybe using an example?
Sure. So blogs is a very complicated space, as we were discussing, and the main reason is because you wouldn't find an explicit network in blogs. In essence, that when you look at Twitter space, you have followers and friends, and you can build a diffusion graph or a social network, communication network, and you can understand who is tweeting or retweeting on whom and how the information memes are traveling. In blogs, however, you have separate web pages, and they are very rarely connected to each other, right? So when you are trying to identify blogs that are a focus of research or a subject of research, first you have to start with an entire internet space. You cannot just go to Twitter like website where you can search for keywords and you get all these relevant Twitter feeds. Here you have to start search from the entire vast spaces of internet and start looking and zooming into the pockets of interest, which is another exercise, highly meticulous and careful, and mostly involves human effort, where you start with a very carefully selected keywords and start snowballing your keywords through the information that you have discovered. Right? You look into relevant entities that may be helpful to get to the right blogs. Once you do that, then you start looking into something called cyber forensic or social cyber forensics, where it can help you build that underlying network among these blogs. So as I mentioned, there is no explicit network on blogs, but you can use things like who is registered on these blogs, if they have used the same email addresses on various other platforms like Twitter, like Facebook. And we have used these techniques in many cases, Ukraine, Russia conflicts, and NATO exercises that have been done, and how pro-Russian media puts an anti-US or anti-Western spin on those exercises. ISIS related stuff. So there we are looking at how these blogs are somehow connected. In other words, how we can infer a network among these blogs and bloggers. Further, you can get even more sophisticated. You can explore how these bloggers are using traffic analysis tools or traffic or website trackers, and each of these web trackers have unique codes which are associated with a unique email address, and you can use those to identify if a blogger has multiple blog sites and what they're talking about on one blog may be different than the other, and how you can piece all that information together to build a more comprehensive profile for a blogger or someone who is of interest. So one of the slides here, if we can roll back to real quick, the one where we have the two tools, that's all. Yeah, so here on the bottom right corner, we have a tool called focal structure analysis, and this is a very small network of blogs. These are not Twitter accounts, these are bloggers who are connected through such mechanism that I just described. Okay? And these connections led us to identify who are the most coordinating set of bloggers in an information campaign. Okay, and this was one of the bloggers here that was identified was Graham Phillips, who was supposed to be an internet celebrity when he went to Ukraine, and through his live blogging style, he shot to instant fame, and a lot of people started following him and started believing what he had to say, but his rhetoric was all pro-Russian and anti-Ukraine, anti-West, and he was quickly identified by the Ukrainian government, and he was banned from entering Ukraine. He was originally a British citizen, and then he moved to Russia. Now he has a completely new blogging identity, and he has a new blogging site, and he blogs from Russia. His equipment, his computers, phones, and everything was seized. Every NATO conference, every NATO summit, he tries to get into Ukraine to cover that event, but he is always banned. He cannot travel to Ukraine and attend those summits. We did not know all of that. Somehow this was identified by the tool that we have developed, this focal sector analysis, based on how he has been coordinating, how he has been linked through all that methodology. And when we shared this with our liaison at NATO, and he practically jumped from the chair. He said, "How did you know this? We don't know the context behind why you are so surprised." So he shared all of that information with us, and that led us to believe, yes, this is something that we need to follow. We need to rigorously investigate into and see if there are other such hidden pockets of interest lying in the blogosphere that we can identify through this methodology.
So you have one question on the Twitter sphere from India, Joe Kolho. So he says, you mentioned that there are different platforms emerged to serve different user needs, but have now morphed into becoming more news feed. He says, what happens when some of these can these merge into a platform and become harder to control?
That's interesting. So, as some of the other panelists have also mentioned, that choice of platform has to be dealt also with the context that lies behind it. So it does make it very, very complicated to analyze conjoined forms of analysis here, looking at multiple platforms. However, if we follow a scientific and rigorous methodology, we can tease these things out. We can tease these individual communications out from one space to the other, and then build a diffusion network or communication network of some sorts, knowing how information is traveling from one platform to the other. Also, there is a caveat here, because we have been talking very specifically about platforms. Now, we always keep observing new platforms on the horizon. So we have something called Gab.ai, we have Reddit, and the methodology that we are developing, or we hope to develop, should be generic enough, or should be grounded in theory, so that we can take those methodologies, take those software tools to other platforms. So it should not be very specific to one platform or a couple of platforms, and then it breaks down when we take it to the other platforms. So that's a delicate sort of a dance that we have to play when we think about methodologies and bringing those methodologies to these new information environments, highly dynamic evolving information.
Great. Thank you. So with that, we'll open it up to the room. And those of you who are watching on WebEx, again, if you're on WebEx, type your question in the chat box, and Sienna will raise her hand and ask the question for you. So do we have questions here in the room?
This is mostly for Kathleen.
So Randy Bryant from CMU.
From CMU. I know Kathleen mostly, but you others too.
Oh, and we have a mic, if you would pass that around so that they can hear you on WebEx.
I know that you've done a lot of work just purely on the sort of looking at the graph and the network analysis, and you can often find sort of various behavior. Do you think that's a fairly effective way of looking for these botnets and other sort of artificial injection of misinformation, or will those people just get more clever and hide themselves better as you be more aggressive about it?
Okay, so I think that it is useful to look at it from a graph perspective, but it's useful to look at it from looking at the graphs and how they're changing, and to look at them in terms of more high-dimensional graphs. So if we just look at, like say the mentions network, who's mentioning whom, eventually I think that won't be where you'll see these groups. We are seeing them there now, but even now we have to find them in what they're talking about, the hashtag network and the mention graph at the same time. So we have to use multidimensional graphs to find them, and then we have to look at them over time. So I think that will continue to be effective, because these structures, you can't both spread a message effectively and hide yourself all at the same time. And so there's certain structures that are good for spreading messages, and those structures are good can be found.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel here? Rand or Juan, would you like to jump in at all on some comments?
Well, the only additional comment I would make is that when you're looking for things, different types of activity, it isn't what you're not trying to find a false statement or a true statement or whatever. What you're trying to look for is intent. what is the intent of the narrative that's being pushed? So first you need to be focused on narrative detection, right? And the narratives today, when they're done by people who really know what they're doing, are actually transmedia. So transmedia storytelling, transmedia narrative pushing is what's becoming really important, right? So these are people pushing narratives across multiple types of platforms, multiple types of media, and you have to be able to track that collectively. Otherwise, you're really missing something. That's one issue. The other issue is you have multiple players. So it isn't just one group or one person that's trying to push a narrative that you're trying to detect, but there are many happening simultaneously. And so you have to start to think about, what are the dynamics of different people who are trying to seize control of the narrative in different topics. So these are things that you need to keep into account. So the problem, that's one problem with limiting your view to one platform or one type of messaging. You miss the big picture, and that's really crucial to understand what's going on.
I would like to.
Go ahead, Juan.
Okay.
Go ahead, Juan.
One point I would like to add is, yes, it is true that bots are becoming more intelligent and more difficult to detect. And in the past, it's very easy just by looking at a simple network structure, like how big, how lonely they are, you can do it. But then now, because they become more intelligent, so we have to use like more nuanced methods. For example, in one of the projects we worked on is about the sarcasm detection on Twitter. So we found that early days, we just need to look at each tweet, but then it becomes less effective. You have to look at, as Rand mentioned, narratives. You have to look at a sequence of tweets. Basically, you have to look at the conversation. Then you will be able to more effective to detect sarcasm. Likewise for the bots. As Kathleen mentioned, you have to use multiple dimension of data and multiple different types of networks. But we also need to look into the content, as well as, for example, in the future, we'll probably have to look into the sentiments. Because the robots, these bots, if you want to create a large number of bots, it is difficult to make everyone, first of all, very individual, and second, they look like a human. So if we look into more details, then we will be able to find them. But it's an arms race, basically. Both sides are working. That's why big data research will continue. Yes.
Great. Kathleen, do you want to follow on your comment?
I just wanted to pick up on Rand's point and point out that one of the ways even though we find these dense communities with graph detection techniques and so on, there are linking out to cross media, to multiple platforms, and the most effective ones of them are actually linking to some of the same different sites. So so they'll actually all link to the same YouTube channel or the same Facebook page or the same, whatever page. And a lot of those conversations will look like, did you see? And they'll point to a URL. And so you have to go track those, and a lot of that conversation is carried then through images, many of which are photoshopped. So.
Great. There was a question here at the end. Introduce yourself first. And then...
I'm Bill Shirless. I actually want to follow up on a comment that Rand made, but that has also been evident in the remarks of the other speakers, which is this kind of recognition that we're moving from point-wise lies, one lie in a tweet, to purposeful narratives supported across multiple media platforms, what some people might call an information warfare campaign, or what Rand was calling active measures. So I want to ask a question of how can we from the academic perspective, detect and study and understand these narratives and the way that they are being implemented. This is a long tradition, goes back a century or so, this idea of information warfare, deliberate campaigns. But also, what kinds of countermeasures might be created to counter these narratives when they're adverse to our
Excellent
interests?
question. Rand, did you want
Did you
to?
get that, Rand?
Yes, I did, Bill. Thank you. So here's the big deal, right? So people talk about countering, but it isn't about. It's not trying to counter something as much as it is providing a viable alternative. You need to replace one narrative with another. Narratives exist, mythology exists, all of these things exist because they fill a need of some sort.
Sure.
Right? So you can't just discredit one or try to fight against one without providing. The main way you do it is by providing an alternative. And then the question becomes, how do you actually inject the alternative and get it to replace the one you don't like? And now, of course, you're doing that in the environment where there are multiple actors trying to do exactly the same thing.
So you're saying,
But the key.
you're saying the best defense is a good offense. That is to say, provide a counteroffensive using similar techniques.
It's actually providing a replacement. That's the only thing you can really do. I mean, of course, you could try to discredit the other people, but it's much more effective to provide a replacement. Because remember, the other guy who's trying to push a narrative, he's succeeding because he's selling something people want to buy. I mean, the absolutely essential ingredient of a good con, right? One famous con man said, was to have a willing victim. All right. So narratives are successful because they're selling something that people fundamentally want to buy. So if you're not happy with that one, then you have to provide an alternative that they're going to be even more happy to buy. So that means that you have to understand what is exactly the need that you're trying to fulfill, that somebody's attacking. You can't be making this stuff up out of nothing for no reason, right? So you always have to build on something which exists. Otherwise, you never get anywhere. So yes, so it's finding a replacement and saying, yes, look, here's a much better way to do things or idea on how to handle things. So that's to me, that's the general approach that you need to take.
Yeah, I would like to add is in order to effectively handle misinformation, counter argument won't be effective. Basically, people realize that you have to just expose, but don't engage. And that's one of the best strategies. And so as Rand mentioned, I also mentioned this in my 3 slides. We need to detect. The important point is we need to detect misinformation. Then we should offer alternatives for clarification and also point out the sources of facts. So it is very difficult to change people's mind. Usually there's something called a group polarization, right? So as a matter of fact, if you engage in the discussion becomes heated, but at the end, the two parties will be farther apart, not they get closer. So that's why engaging won't help, but providing alternatives will be effective for changing the mind of the silent majority, not those who hired to get online as trolls or shows.
So there was a great example in the last election, right? When Hillary Clinton basically called people who disagreed with her deplorables. Well, you know what? That's not a way to win friends and influence people, right? So it isn't attacking something that they fundamentally believe that doesn't work. I mean, it can never work. So just by trying to discredit something, that doesn't work. Even exposing something, even that doesn't really work. I still insist it's the replacement. It's offering a viable alternative. That's the critical element.
Excellent.
Because you can't tell people just that, you're just stupid. That doesn't really work. That's not the way to get at them.
So thinking about the spread of misinformation, how good are we at detecting this in real time tracking it, and then, as you've already talked about, how to mitigate it, but how do we even identify that it's there and know that it's there in real time before it spreads deeply?
So we're actually
Yeah, at the
really,
moment, terrible.
yeah, terrible. I totally agree. Not only are we bad at predicting,
By the way, I just want to add one thing. Not only are we terrible, but we're terrible on purpose. Okay? And we're terrible on purpose because the United States government basically doesn't want to have anything to do with the issue. So when I say we, I'm talking about in the government, right? So if you refuse to even participate, well, you're not going to be very good. I mean, so that's where we are.
So we'll get to what does the government need to do in a little bit before we close. Kathleen.
So I was going to say that there's a growing body of work out there on how to identify false information. There's a growing number of studies out there. But some of the stuff suggests that you have to actually divide up recognize that there's different kinds of false narratives, such as those intended to distract, those that are more extremist focused, those are like spam, and that each one of them requires different strategies for recognition and different strategies for countering them. The other thing is that what we haven't talked about much is that even where a lot of this stuff is being spread by bots and special AI tools and so on, those things can be used in reverse to also spread counter messages, and that has not been explored much except by marketing firms. But I think we also had a question from the audience.
Yeah, was there a question from the audience? Yes. Identify yourself and.
Sure. Matthew Benini, one of Kathleen's students. So my question is, if the way forward is to replace the narrative, and for lack of a better word, our information adversary is clearly using deceptive means to promote their narrative, what would you think, from our case, either that be government or academia, if we're going to counter that, how can we compete in that space in a manner that's moral?
Okay, well, if you want my honest opinion, you got to take morals and throw them out the window. Sorry. Well, that's it. I mean, if you show up to a fight with a knife and your opponent has a machine gun, you lose. Sorry. That's it.
Yeah, so
if you want to take the moral high ground, then that's the ground you're going to end up buried in. Sorry.
Yeah, my point is it's a war. It's a cyber war. So we have to. It's just basically it's a war.
Yes, and in war you use whatever means necessary. That's
Yes.
it.
Yes. You have to think.
So, Rand, this is Matt again. So with that said, do you think that there's a cost in our credibility in other environments if, as a government, you start using the same deceptive tactics that some of our adversaries are? And how can you weigh that cost-benefit?
Well, so first of all, you have to do that on a case by case basis. And when I say, it's not, like I said, it isn't about false things. Everybody's focused on things that are false. First of all, you need to take the idea of false and throw it out the window, right? I mean, it goes back to what I was saying. It's telling people whatever you need to tell them to make them to put your point across. False, true, irrelevant. Doesn't even come into the question. All right. So if you look at the way the Russians operate, for example, the Russians can change their story on an hourly basis if it suits their needs. Doesn't matter. And they could be saying true things. They could be saying half-true things. They could be saying completely false things. I mean, what is false? I hear a lot of discussion about, well, is there some set of facts? Can we, just put the facts forward? Well, what are facts? I mean, that's a bogus concept, actually, for the most part. Because anything that I tell you, any information that I provide or that comes your way, you're going to interpret it in your own personal context. It's got to fit into your own world. And once you start interpreting it, it loses a lot of its objective value. So you can't be going on objective value. Objectivity is not really the point anymore. So, credibility, I don't know. I don't even know if credibility is an issue anymore in that way. It's as long as you're saying something that somebody will buy, then you're credible. It's a functional thing at this point.
So it's interesting you bring this up because at the same time on social media we were asked what is the responsibility of computer scientists and IT folks in this space to act ethically versus what is the role and responsibility of the media in this process. Kathleen or Nitin, do you want to comment on this?
Oh, okay. I think at this point we're still trying to understand even what it would mean to act ethically in some of this area. It's not clear what ethics mean in some sense. You know, given the way that, you know, because it's all consensus formation and so on. So I think it's a very hard issue. I also think that we sometimes are overreacting to the information that appears false when it's really originally meant as humor and as sarcasm. And we need to begin to understand how to discriminate sarcastic remarks from actual spread of false information and tell when one is one versus the other. And without that, I think we could overreact to a lot of things.
I have a comment on the other question that you had just previously about how we can address some of these misinformation. So there are many efforts, computational as well as crowdsourced, that are out there. So if someone is interested in knowing how we can tackle the problem of misinformation, there are these computational AI-based solutions, machine learning-based solutions. You're trying to train a model and deciding whether the information is false or true. But also there are efforts like stopfake.org or EU vs Disinfo group, which is trying to validate what information is being put out there versus if it could be something rumor or disinformation. However, such efforts are largely overwhelmed and outnumbered by the troll and the bots that the information that they have been disseminating in masses. So these technologies, these solutions are out there, but they are not adequate, and we need to do more to advance this science of this space.
So I'd like to add, we're talking about kind of hostile information warfare. We have colleagues at the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford who are looking at how social media can be used to build bridges between parties. For example, they're doing research in Israel between the Israeli and Palestinian populations and how to build those positive bridges. It also can be used as. So, does any other questions from the audience?
By the way, I would just make one. I would make one comment on that. You know, so it's great to try to do a thing like that, what you just described, to build bridges of that way. The question is, how do you do that in a completely hostile environment? And the problem with the people who are doing research on these kind of things is they seem to ignore the fact that all these things are happening in very hostile environments, and that the type of interference that's going to be perpetrated is going to be enormous, and it's going to come from multiple directions. So if you try to do research like that in isolation, then sort of a priori you lose. So you need to take the other things into account, and people just don't seem to want to do that.
Great. Thank you, Rand. Bill, did you want to?
Yeah, I hope you don't mind another question, and it's related to this discussion about narrative and offensive media campaigns and counter-offensive media campaigns. And it does seem to me, from my uninformed perspective, that perhaps one thing that we can do in the academy is to try to understand a little bit better the tools that are used to launch these campaigns, and kind of take an infrastructure-based approach a little bit. And I'm just curious, I mean, that's part of the purpose of this discussion, obviously, but given the reality of what's going on and given the kind of intuitive resonance of Rand's comments, like it or not, I'm just wondering how we might address this situation from our perspective of trying to develop an understanding and also trying to improve the tools and capabilities that we have, you know, maybe even to advance the possibility of doing better at these counter narratives.
So,
recognizing it cuts both ways.
in organizational theory, people often point to restaurants as like the E. coli of organizational research, because you can go out and study just about anything about organizations with restaurants because they come and go so fast. And in social media, there are equivalent E. coli areas, okay? And so one of those, for right at the moment, tends to be things that we found associated kind of by doing searches on the alt-right. There's this kind of an E. coli area where there are lots of these dense groups coming and going very fast, but all very focused on special topics, very much event-driven, very much linked across media. And by finding these E. coli areas, they give you an environment, if you will, that's a live, real environment in which you can test out lots of new technologies and test out different theories and so on about, both how to spread ideas and how to stop the spread of ideas and so on. And it appears that these areas are actually being used by a lot of people to actually test out ideas for how to join groups together, how to break them apart, how to spread ideas, how to spread them apart. And so you can also watch what other people are learning by watching these areas.
So I'm sorry, Kathleen, I didn't hear clearly. Where are these areas exactly? What are you talking about?
They're just on different parts of the web. Like we found was one area by looking through the alt-right, and we found a bunch of these little pockets of dense topic groups. Okay, that are not your big special ones around ISIS or whatever, but there's a whole bunch of them, and and they can be linked together and pulled apart and so on. So they become just kind of a nice test bed area. And you can find other ones like this on social media.
You're good? Okay. All right. Any other questions here? Do we have any online? Those of you who are on WebEx, you can type your question in the chat box, and Sienna will ask the panelists if anyone has anything. Does anyone else in the audience like to ask a question? No one can see you. No one can see you. Yeah, you are safe from.
Perhaps I could, while you're thinking of a question, I just want to mention that I want to bring back up this issue of sarcasm in images and so on. I mean, for a long time, people thought that we could get at this by just looking at a single tweet or a single blog post or something. And then he said, sentiment is going to help us. And of course, sentiment tools are terrible. But what we're seeing now is that you actually have to track full conversations. And I think we're trying to talk about here is that there's a whole new approach that you need to take, which is focus in on the discourse, focus in on the conversation. And by focusing in on the conversation, as opposed to taking a tweet out of context or a Facebook page out of context, you actually realize that something that you thought was, highly negative becomes like neutral. Okay, something you thought was really funny is not funny anymore. That the image that's attached to it completely inverts what's said before that. And so it's these kind of discourse centric conversation following techniques that we need to develop new technology for, and it's very hard with current AI software.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to get even harder when you start taking into account the video and the images.
So then the question earlier was, and Rand, you mentioned that in previous years the government hasn't necessarily focused on this area and doing research in this area. Where do we need to look now? What are the priority areas for both academe and for government and industry going forward?
Well, I think they've been brought up. I mean, it's really, how do you do narrative detection? That's really that's the biggest, that's an immediate problem. Mm-hmm. Because like Kathleen was saying, one tweet or one item, even one article, it's very difficult to, sarcasm only means something in a larger context, right? There's no such thing as sarcasm in isolation. It's sarcasm relative to something. So what we need is better tools to detect, like you're saying, all of these narratives, and to actually be able to disentangle one narrative from another and to really get a clear picture, in the broad sense of what's going on. So those tools, we really don't have, and that's where we need to focus a lot of effort.
I'm going to ask the panelists to give closing statements, and then I'll have a few announcements to make at the end. Thank you, Rand.
So as a closing statement, I would say that it's a completely new information environment. We need new technologies. We need to follow the conversation, and we need to watch out for social bots.
I would just add that this is a very infant information environment, and this can be considered as a lawless Wild West of information space. So we need to think more scientifically, more rigorously, and develop more capabilities that can address the issues that we have stepped into in this round.
So my closing statement is we need to promote and build diverse collective intelligence And then as a computer scientist, we should enable user-controlled information filter and checkers.
Rand, one word?
I think I said enough.
Great. Well, so we'd like to extend a warm thank you to our panelists and to our audience for their time in today's engaging discussion. Before we close, I'd like to mention some events that are coming up for the South Big Data Innovation Hub. Applications are being accepted until March 15th for the Data Science for Social Good program in Atlanta. The Atlanta Data Science for Social Good program is an intensive 10-week paid internship experience that blends data science and technology design. Interested undergraduate students should visit www.dssg-atl.io. There's a smart grid workshop on April 18th, Texas A&M University College Station, which is a South Hub Spoke grant recipient, is holding a hands-on workshop on smart grids, big data, the next steps. If you're interested in attending, please visit http://smartgridcenter.tamu.edu. The next South Hub Data Sharing and Infrastructure Working Group will be held on March 31st from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern. There'll be demos from Internet2 and SciDAS, and you can go to southbigdatahub.org to get more information on that. The Southern Data Science Conference will be held April 7th in Atlanta. Those interested in attending should go to southerndatascience.com. Our South Big Data Hub Roundtable for next month will be held on Thursday, April 13th from noon to 1:30 Eastern. It will feature a panel on data science challenges of cancer immunotherapy. You can visit bit.ly/South Hub Roundtables for more information. And lastly, I'll let Kathleen and Nitin plug the conference they've got coming up in the summer.
So in July 5th through 8th, there will be the conference, the SBP BRIMS. The data challenge this year is on fake news. So those of you who are interested in this topic, please see our website. Please send in a submission, and we hope to see you there.
The website is sbp-brims.org, and there are a few graduate student travel scholarships. So if you have something in mind, if you have something cooking up, please submit and please visit us. It's a very nice young 10th year though. This is the 10th year. So we're planning to bring in some cake and cut some cake.
And so for those of you who were... Sorry, Rand?
Leah, can I just put in one more plug?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would just like to inform everybody that we have created a new organization called the Information Professionals Association. And this is founded by me and a guy who was former director of I/O at the USDP and a few other people. And so this new association is about to, we're an incorporated 501c3. We have already first corporate sponsors. And our website is about to go live. And we are going to be holding our first symposium on cognitive security at the sort of end of August, beginning of September timeframe. So please look out for that. Anybody who's interested, they can contact me, and I'll give them the exact details when it comes announced.
Rand, where will it be held?
In D.C.
Oh, in South Hub. All right, so let's talk. Definitely.
In Washington, D.C. Huh?
Fantastic. Well, with that, thank you all, and we will close for the day.
Thank you.